So it's really important to keep in mind that in 1777, after the complete break from Mother England, the United States began the process of establishing its own form of government, a central government that would bring the country together so as not to have another country assert its power over it. This was known as the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation was really primarily created, modeled after the state constitutions and the state governments. Prior to the revolution, as we had already discussed, those who were monopolizing government, those who were in power in government throughout the colonies were primarily wealthy planters, people who owned slaves, many, many slaves. You had merchants and lawyers, people who lived on the East Coast who had established themselves, some second, third, fourth generation people, and the money was very much tied within the family. They were strong family, hereditary families that had monopolized the power in these states, in these colonies now turned states. But after the revolution, what we have now is a totally different dynamic. We have now more and more farmers, particularly small yeoman farmers, those who really did not own slaves, those who were really just seeking to become part of their government because they had just fought a revolution. And now that they had fought a revolution, they had witnessed brothers and family members die. They had become maimed and disabled as a result of this revolution. They come back now expecting to have representation, and more of them are going to become involved in their representative governments. So, what was a majority before the war, which were primarily planter class and wealthy elites, now shifts to more of a majority towards farmers and small property owners. And more of these voting requirements are going to shift. So, where one had to have a certain amount of property in order to vote, now one did not have to have that in the States. So, you have something called this more equalizing benefit after the war. Really, more men of moderate means were becoming representatives. And in many ways, this was a good thing because people felt that the people in control of government were people they could relate to. They were people who had fought in the war. These were people they trusted because they were willing to die for the nation. And they now were in a level of authority where they could help the poorer classes or the sort of moderate classes, if you will. And keep in mind too that those of the upper classes, those men of the upper classes, and those who had great hereditary wealth, oftentimes were against the revolution. They had been men of the older order that sort of believed that the best form of government was governed by aristocracy and elites and people tied to the monarchy. Whereas after the revolution, it's the complete opposite. What we have now is the rise of republicanism, this idea of a republic, the idea of virtue, taking care of your family, taking care of your farm, establishing, good good ways of living so as to create peace within your communities and a thriving economy. Now, from 1777 to 1787, the Continental Congress established what was called the Articles of Confederation, and this was the first draft of government, and it was really a loosely tied group of states coming together and establishing themselves. They, of course, established their own state constitutions. They had their own forms of government. Some states had a unicameral legislature, which was one house. Most states had bicameral legislatures. You had judiciaries. You had executive governors in power. But I will say that these states typically created measures within their systems of government so as to ensure that the executive power was not too powerful. The executive power was always at the mercy or under the thumb, per se, of the legislature. So governors did not have all that much power after the revolution. And it was specifically and intentionally designed in that way. So, as again, to always keep a check on the power structure so that no one group of people became too powerful over another. I should also mention that many states forbade slavery, and that's really a wonderful thing. You had states like Vermont in 1777 that abolished slavery completely. You had states like Massachusetts in 1783 that abolished slavery, and so on and so forth. But come the time of 1785, 1786, we start to see a lot of things happening, particularly problems arising from the Articles of Confederation. And this had a lot to do with the trade that was taking place, commercial transactions between states. Some states had more resources and could sell more things to other states, and they could tax other states however they wanted to tax them, and they could use certain currencies. So there was no real uniform way of establishing this nation, even though we were together as in Articles of Confederation, a confederation of states. We were not unified completely because some states had more resources. For example, you had the Potomac River that was near Virginia, and so Virginia had a lot of power because they had already paid their Revolutionary War debts, and they had the Potomac River running through it. And that caused a lot of animosity between Maryland and Virginia. And so you also had some states that had Western land claims, and they were able to, claim more land, and they could sell that land as they saw fit and pay off Revolutionary War debts. Other smaller states could not do that, and so there was a lot of tension and competition between states as a result of that. Furthermore, the central government could not force taxation on the states. I mean, states could voluntarily give up taxation to the central government, but the central government could not force states to pay taxes. So, again, some states were able to pay off those Revolutionary War debts, other states were not. You also had a lot of disgruntled farmers, people who had come back from the Revolutionary War only to find that their farms had foreclosed. They could not pay the taxes. For example, the revolt that took place in Massachusetts under Daniel Shays. Daniel Shays was a farmer, he was a Revolutionary War vet. He couldn't pay his taxes, and so he revolts against the Massachusetts legislature. And the result of that created a huge stir in the hearts of many of the founders who argued that we can't have anarchy in our states. We can't just have people coming together and forming revolutions anytime they're not happy with taxation. We have to address this issue. And so perhaps we need to come together and do that. So by 1787, a constitutional convention is going to be held in secret in Philadelphia. Hmm. We all know what happens in secret, you know, doesn't always stay in secret. And that certainly was the case with the Philadelphia Convention. Now, the purpose, of course, was to come together and reform the Articles of Confederation because the question is, if we're going to call ourselves a country, if we're going to ensure that no foreign nation is going to interfere in our domestic affairs, if we're going to ensure that we remain financially stable and strong, then we might need to come together and reform some things. And that's certainly what these delegates did. Now, many of the delegates came into this convention with their own ideas, ready to just, kind of sell their ideas to the convention. Men like James Madison, for example, comes ready and prepared with his Virginia plan, and he's ready to sell that Virginia plan and say, I have an idea here. Of course, he's studied governments since the time of antiquity, and so people are going to listen to James Madison, and then you hear people who are going to listen to William Patterson of New Jersey, from a small state, and he has this different plan. And then, of course, they come to this compromise, what's called the Great Compromise, and they decide on really, a specific form of government, kind of mixing the two, the large and the small state plan. Uh, and this was, of course, proposed by Roger Sherman from Connecticut. And the whole purpose was really to establish the separation of powers, a bicameral legislature where you had a Senate or the upper chamber, and of course, two members from each state that would form this federal government. And then you had a House of Representatives or the lower chamber, which was apportioned by the population. So they figured, if you just go by the population, you could, some bigger states will have more representatives than the smaller states, but at least you have two senators from each state, and so in that sense, you're equalizing the system. How do you sell a stronger central government? And that was really the teeth of the federal constitution and the constitutional convention. It was to create a stronger federal government so as to tax the states and to ensure that no one state has more power than another state, and it was to create standing armies or militaries that could serve in wars to fight off foreign entities and foreign enemies. There were a lot of good things that came out of the Philadelphia Convention, but not everyone was keen on the idea of a strong central government. And certainly you had a group of men and women, but men really mostly, who had written about this newly formed constitution. They were known as the Anti-Federalists. And by the way, I want to make it very clear, this term Anti-Federalist is very misleading because they actually were Federalists. They believed in federalism. They believed in working with a central government. They believed in the states being able to have authority over their own governments, um, but also working with the federal government when it came to commercial issues, disputes between states, taxation, what have you. But the Federalists, those who were really, really pushing for a strong nation and a strong national government, called them anti-federalists. They referred to them as anti-federalists because they figured if we can call them anti-federalists, it'll look better for us. Whenever you're called the anti-party, it never looks good, right? You're the anti-party, right? You're the anti-party. But the Federalists really were nationalists. They believed in a strong central government, and so how are they going to sell this idea? And so you have a series of papers that are going to be published between Anti-Federalists and Federalists. And we typically know about the Federalist papers, which are really very interesting to read. We rarely know about the Anti-Federalist papers. By the way, the Federalist papers would not have really existed without the Anti-Federalist papers, because the first paper to be written was an Anti-Federalist paper, and that is by Robert Yates. And so looking at Brutus 1, Robert Yates is really pushing against this strong central government. And so he says in his tract, and he's referring to the citizens of the state of New York. Notice how he refers to them as the citizens of the state of New York. He's not referring to them as the citizens of the Articles of Confederation. He's referring to them as the people of their state, because each state had its own identity, its own economy, its own culture and way of doing things. And people were proud of their states. There's a reason why when we watch these sports games and it's Michigan versus Ohio, people are so passionate, you know, between the two. There's such a strong competition because they really have a strong affiliation, a strong love and affinity for their state. He says here in his tract, the legislative power is competent to lay taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. There is no limitation to this power, unless it be said that the clause which directs the use to which those taxes and duties shall be applied may be said to be a limitation. But this is no restriction of the power at all, for by this clause they are to be applied to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. But the legislature have authority to contract debts at their discretion. They are the sole judges of what is necessary to provide for the common defense, and they only are to determine what is for the general welfare. This power, therefore, is neither more nor less than a power to lay and collect taxes, imposts, and excises at their pleasure. Not only the power to lay taxes unlimited as to the amount they may require, but it is to perfect an absolute to raise them in any mode they please. I think this is really interesting because what Brutus is saying is that the central government, the real purpose of the central government is not simply just to protect the states and give them protect their rights. It's really to assert control over them through taxation. And he really references this when he talks about something called the implied powers. The implied powers refers to the article, the section 8, Article 1. where he even quotes it here. He says that the Congress shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or office thereof. So he's saying here, he's referencing what's called the necessary and proper clause of the Constitution. That's Article 1, Section 8, which gives Congress the power to make all laws that are necessary and proper for carrying out or executing the foregoing powers. And really, those foregoing powers are all listed as to the powers of Congress, which is to, collect taxes, to regulate commerce, to declare war. The list goes on. And Bruce is saying this particular clause is going to be misused by the central government. They're going to basically utilize this section of the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, and state that really anything can be used to execute the foregoing powers. So, for example, um, even though Congress has the right to create an army, let's say Congress would wants to use that army to force a state, let's say, um, to allow for a building to be proposed in that area from the central government that will, let's say a bank. Let's go with the bank. How about that? The Bank of the United States. Let's say Congress wants to establish a bank. Okay, and it did eventually. It established the first Bank of the United States. So let's say that the Congress wants to start a bank and they want to establish a national bank. Even though Congress has the right to print money and control commerce or regulate commerce, they want to establish a central bank. And nowhere in the Constitution does it say Congress has the right to establish a central bank. Well, they can use this clause in the Constitution because basically they can say, well, a central bank will allow us to print money and it will allow us to regulate commerce between states and with foreign nations. And so by using this implied power, they can thus say this is our power to do that, even though it's not explicitly stated in the Constitution. So what Bruce is saying here is that this necessary and proper clause is quite um, it's problematic and it's not to be trusted because it can open the door to all sorts of things that the government can do without the approval of the states. He goes on to say, history furnishes no example of a free republic, anything like the extent of the United States. The Grecian republics were of small extent, so also was that of the Romans, but both of these, it is true, in process of time, extended their conquests over large territories of country, and the consequence was that their governments were changed from that of free governments to those of the most tyrannical that ever existed in the world. So what Brutus is saying here is the the extent of your landmass really determines whether or not you can remain a republic. The larger your landmass, the harder it is. The more extensive, he references the Greeks, the Athenians, and the Romans. When they became republics, they lost their virtue. They became very very arrogant, and they started wanting more and more and more, and their virtue was lost, and morality declined, and eventually they just declined. And so what Brutus is saying here in this tract, he's basically arguing and he's agreeing with Montesquieu that it's good to have small republics because that way you can manage things better, you can self-govern better, you have people who will be more apt to be like-minded, where they will rule together and they will rule in association with one another, and you won't have all these various competing views that are going to cause all kinds of divisions within the states. And he goes on to say, in every government, the will of the sovereign is the law. The will of the sovereign is the law. In despotic governments, the supreme authority being lodged in one, his will is law, and can be as easily expressed to a large extensive territory as to a small one. In a pure democracy, the people are sovereign, and their will is declared by themselves. For this purpose, they must all come together to deliberate and decide. This kind of government cannot be exercised, therefore, over a country of any considerable extent. It must be confined to a single city or at least limited to such bounds as that the people can conveniently assemble, be able to debate, understand the subject submitted to them, and declare their opinion concerning it. So he's making the argument here that when you live in a small, you know, small landmass, you're able to engage in government. You're able to know the big issues. You're able to invest more and come together and debate the issues more. I think of, our wards and our city councils. That's really where the real magic happens, is in our locales. That's where real representative government happens. And if it's not representative, then we need to change it, right? We need to vote in new people. Um, but here he's saying the larger the government, the harder it is to know who your representatives are, right? It's harder to know who the people are in control and what it is they want to do and what their interests are. And really trusting them is harder to do because you don't see them on a daily basis. You don't meet with them. And so as a result, the republic declines. And so what you're going to have is a rise of tyranny. So how does Alexander Hamilton respond to Robert Yates? Well, this is what Alexander Hamilton says. He says, among the most formidable of the obstacles which the new Constitution will have to encounter may readily be distinguished the obvious interest of a certain class of men in every state to resist all changes which may hazard a diminution of the power, emolument, and consequence of the offices they hold under the state establishments, and the perverted ambition of another class of men who will either hope to aggrandize themselves by the confusions of their country, or will flatter themselves with fairer prospects of elevation from the subdivisions of the empire into several partial confederacies than from its union under one government. So, what he's saying here is it's possible that the states may start to join amongst each other and create partial confederacies and create these little mini confederacies out of the Articles of Confederation and start to pit themselves against other groups of states instead of serving as one unified government. And he also makes the claim that sometimes, even though states are smaller, and the idea is that government will be better representative when it's smaller, he believes that actually this opens up the door to more tyranny, because without a check on state governments, you're going to have more problems with state governments. State governments can be just as oppressive as the federal government. So to him, there needs to be a check and balance so that the federal government can check the state governments and the state governments can check the federal government. It has to go both ways. So, in essence, he's saying that sometimes the loudest voices for liberty, sometimes the loudest voices for a republic and for virtue can be sometimes the most oppressive. Those people who are speaking on behalf of liberty, who are speaking on behalf of their states, could be the ones who want to gather all the power and maintain that power for themselves. The debate here is ultimately between those who are really not trusting a strong central government and those who say, well, without a strong central government, you don't have a country. You will only have a series of confederacies which can loosely be tied and which can eventually break away and form countries of their own. And that's sort of what happened with the Confederacy come the time of the Civil War, having formed a country within itself among the deep southern states. But this kind of leads us into the future. What do we do with this information? What do we do with knowing that the debate over government? What is good government? What is the right form of government? Do we want a small republic? Do we want to be able to manage ourselves and govern ourselves? Absolutely. That's the beauty of the United States. Or do we want a strong central government that will assert its power over the people? Well, we certainly don't want that, but we do understand the value of a central government. We know that a central government can serve a good purpose when it comes to protecting the rights of the states. And when it doesn't serve the purpose of protecting the rights of the states, well, that's when you're going to have big problems, okay? So that kind of leads us to the present day, whether it's the COVID vaccines, whether it's data centers, whether it's going to war, deciding to go to war or not. Government plays a role. The central government, the federal government, plays a very big role in determining these factors. And so we as the people now ought to invest in our governments. And I think this is what the Revolutionary War teaches us, that we are to invest in our governments, whether it be at the local level, the state, or the federal level, because we as citizens have the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And if those liberties are being trampled on, even by our own governments, we have the right to speak about it, to speak up, to try to reform it, to do whatever it takes, really, in a peaceful manner to make sure that we as American citizens are living out the spirit and the dream of 1776.